All right, welcome everybody to another FanFiAddict family panel, and this week we're going to be chatting with Tom, Tori, and Eleni from the blog about the SFF that we read as kids. So starting off, we have Tori. How are you?
I am good. Hey everybody.
Hello.
Hello. My book's coming out next Halloween.
Woo! Well, we'll go through everybody else, and then you can tell us more about that if you want to.
Okay, cool.
Next up, we have Tom Harnett joining us from England. How are you, buddy?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I can't think of anything to say, but I have a beard.
It's all I am. It's all I have. And then finally, we have Eleni Argyro. She's joining us from Italy. And how are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to be here for the first time recording with everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome. Yeah, because Tori and Tom have already been on the podcast, but Eleni's here for the first time. So
I'm finally back home where I can record.
Tom and I are seasoned pros.
One episode is all you need.
I'm amazed you invited us back, to be honest.
Seriously.
No, you guys are fucking off the podcast from now.
He's had enough of you. Don't drag me down too, please.
Get out of here. Giving
you knew what this was.
Oh man. Well, for listeners and viewers who are joining us for the first time, we'll start with Tori. If you could give us a little introduction about yourself and talk to us about your book.
Okay. So I'm Tori. I live in Kentucky. If you can't tell by the way I speak. I am actually a recent graduate for my master's, and my first book got published, which is coming out next Halloween. It is called Zodiac Rising, and it is through Shadowspark Publishing, and I am so freaking excited. I've literally wanted to do this since I was a kid, and it's honestly a dream come true. I still can't believe that it's real. So
yeah, well, congratulations. I mean, I know we've all said it enough, but it's really, really cool.
We're also proud of you.
Thank you.
It's very exciting.
And Tom, why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about yourself?
Tom Bookbeard on Twitter, and I regularly post about books and beards all over the interwebs. And that's really it. I'm quite boring, actually. But yes, I'm here. I'm talking. You can't even see my mouth, but that's fine. That's me.
Humble Tom, so humble always. And Eleni, what about you? Tell everyone a bit about yourself.
Well, I am a Greek who lives in Italy, studies in Scotland occasionally. But I also just got my undergrad in literature. I am taking a sabbatical for a while, and thank you. And I am, while I prep a master's in research on SFF, so I'm using the sabbatical to read as much as I can, so I can work something out, so I can write something fancy, which is a big excuse to read a lot, basically.
It's not a bad excuse to read.
Congratulations! I didn't know that.
Thank you. So, yeah.
Cool. And Eleni, since we're on you, I'm gonna ask everybody to kind of tell us about their first exposure to sci-fi or fantasy. If you have any distinct memories from your childhood, and if there was someone in your family that sort of facilitated, gave you books, or encouraged you to read.
Well, I did a post a while ago about my grandfather starting the whole domino, and then my mom is the biggest bookworm ever, so she would read to me from when I was younger until I could learn to read myself. And well, as a typical Greek, a bit cliched, but I started with with our mythology. So my first, you could say it's SFF, I suppose. So that was my first touch. I started with our mythology, and then I moved up to the books that my mom would read me, and all the fairy tales and folk tales. And then I started reading some from school, but never too much, until when I was I'm not sure about the grades, 9 years old, more or less. She took me to a bookstore and she said, pick one. And my starry-eyed tiny eyes picked this big thing because reasons. And I said, I want this one.
How many pages is that? That's huge.
This beauty is, I think, 119? No, that's too much. 1,291 pages. It's 3 books in one, but you know.
Still, your mom was probably pretty excited. She's like, "Cool, I don't have to buy your book for a while."
So this is gonna last her for ages, and it took me like 4 months. But it was my first intro to fantasy, and it opened a whole world for me. So that was amazing. And then from there, I just entered spooky land. But more on that later if you want.
Yeah, and I'm curious. Just thinking back on like Greek mythology and everything like that. For you, I mean, you kind of joke that it's like you could call it SFF, you could call it fantasy, but it's kind of like institutionalized fantasy and folktales. But like, what is it like in Greece? Like the perspective about Greek mythology and how it kind of plays into people's lives.
Well, of course, I cannot speak for Greece in a wider sense, but you know, from my personal experience, our myths are very, very closely knit with our history, and especially because this is a constant of literature in many cultures. To be honest, to be fair, because there is a point in history where it stops being properly recorded history and it starts being mythology and like invented stuff. But the line is very thin because to us, our mythological heroes were proper heroes. So they might have been real people, they might have not. But for us, they were strong, real historical figures that we looked up to. So in one way or another, it was a bit like you should see where it all started from. And you grew up, you know, with the story of, you would say, Achilles, but, you know, also just in general, the gods, because as every myth, it's a cautionary tale. You should know not to be too vain. You should avoid being too, cocky, too brave, too brash. And those are the base teaching for all young kids. So, you know, you start from there, and then eventually you start picking out real people, and you're like, oh, so now it's history. It's no longer fun. Which is not true. But, you know, it becomes more of a studying lesson than, a fun bedtime story.
Yeah, for sure. But at the very least, I think it's cool that from a fundamental societal level, that the myths are taught, and it's kind of like something that you can look back on, you know, like from my perspective, maybe Tom, Tori too, about how like teachings from the Bible present you with moral lessons to carry out in real life, you know.
That's true. That also, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
It's also
go ahead.
Like the religious aspect. Like Greece is an Orthodox country, so that's very relevant as well. But I come from a family who is religious, but not in an overt way. So I wasn't brought up on the Bible, and my mom was like, well, mythology is your actual history. It's your oldest history, so you're going up in mythology. And I'm fine with that. I love it, actually. I much prefer reading about Dionysus being crazy than, you know.
Mm-hmm. That's super cool.
Yeah.
And Tom, coming from England, what was your background like, your introduction to SFF, and if anyone, you know, nudged you into it and showed you the way?
I nudged myself into it. It's funny, Eleni mentioned the Greek myth. I had a talking tape of Odysseus. I listened to that so much, I think I wore it out. But it was, I never really thought about it until now, that it kind of was a building block of science fiction fantasy. And so I was probably 5 or 6 when I had that. But the book that really kicked it all off for me was one that was in our classroom when I was about 8 or 9, and it was this one. It was Dawn of the Dragons by Joe Diva, which is one of those really awesome choose your own adventure books. You know, you can still see my terrible, terrible childish handwriting in it. There you are.
I love those.
Nice.
I mean, I was so crap at these, but quite an impressive array of spells from young Tom there. But yeah, it was just a really cool book. The guy Joe Diva wrote an absolute ton of them, and I read that, and then right after that, I found the Hobbit, and I thought, well, there's dragons in this book. The Hobbit obviously very prominently features a dragon, and that really for me was the slippery slope into growing a humongous beard and reading nothing but sci-fi and fantasy now. And yeah, I almost, I know we're going to talk about it in a bit, but I sort of stopped myself from reading these stories because no one else did. I didn't have any friends who read this. My parents, they tend to read autobiographies or biographies. So I ended up getting into crime fiction for a long, long time because that's what everyone else would read. So it wasn't until I was really a teenager that I started to get back into things like Lord of the Rings. Star Trek was a huge, huge part of my childhood as well, and I actually allowed myself to read some of that too. So yeah, it took me a while to get here to read pretty much nothing but science fiction, fantasy. But I'm so glad I still got these books I can go back to. Oh yeah, the other one that really had a huge impact on me was this one, Red War. I mentioned it when we did the Food and Fantasy podcast, but Red War, the first one, has the best baddie ever. Clooney the Scourge. When I first read this book, I was 8. I literally didn't read all of the good guy bits. I just read Clooney's chapters because I love the character so much. So
Whoa.
I'd recommend reading it that way because it's a really good evil story until the end. We're like, oh damn it, it's a bell on him. So yeah, that's basically my little intro into the genre.
I'll definitely be touching on Redwall as well, but Tori, we'll start with you first.
Okay, so I have kind of a collection over here. So I suppose my first real foray into SFF was this very, very beat up copy of Aragon. I carried this book with me to school and just everywhere I could. It took me a very long time to read it because I would pick it up, read several chapters, and then put it down for months and not touch it because I was so busy in high school and middle school that apparently I was so busy. I mean, that I didn't have time to read. And then, so it kind of evolved from there into Twilight and a very, again, beat up copy of Twilight because when I was a kid, I did not take proper care of my books like I do now. But they're also very well read. I've read this several times, so I don't know what that says about me as a person. But and then I got into sci-fi, and my first foray into sci-fi was Jurassic Park and The Lost World because I am unhealthily obsessed with dinosaurs.
A good obsession to have.
And then it kept going with City of Bones.
I read those too.
I love this series with everything in me. I have the box set of the first 5, and then I got the 6th one, which is about this big. And then the crux of the bunch, I have saved the best for last. This is literally the book that made me want to be a writer. This is the book that cemented the fact that it was what I was going to be, and there was no stopping me. The Hunger Games. I know I talked about this book a lot in the YA panel, but this book is everything to me. it showed me that, you know, I talked about this a little bit in the YA panel, but in Twilight, I really identified with Bella because she was clumsy and she drove a big red truck, and my first vehicle was a 1993 F-150. Her name is Bertha, and I still have her, and I still love her.
Shout out to Bertha.
Shout out to Bertha. And then
long may she reign.
Listen, she's still going. But the Hunger Games showed me that a protagonist doesn't have to be perfect. You know, she doesn't have to be the prettiest. She doesn't have to be the funniest, the sweetest. Katniss is none of those things. Katniss is abrasive. Katniss is rude. Katniss doesn't care what anybody thinks of her. So yeah, this book is everything to me, and it is very well worn. It had some water damage. I took it to Haiti with me when I was there for a mission trip. And my water bottle burst in my bag, and it got all over my book, and I was devastated. So, I came home, and my mom bought me a new copy of The Hunger Games. And I said, thank you, but no thank you. So my beat up copy is the one that I will forever read.
And it survived. That's the most important thing.
It did survive. The words are still there. The words aren't damaged. So, I mean, this is my book. You know, this is it.
It's well
It's
loved.
beautiful.
It looks like you're taking it into the Hunger Games with you, Tori.
Life imitates art.
It does, and it's probably the best book I've ever read.
It needs to be pierced by an arrow for it to truly qualify.
Well, now I have a new goal. I'll see you guys later. I'll be back.
Crossbow or arrow?
Oh man. Well, for me personally, I guess a lot of it started with. I mean, my mom's a huge reader, but she's more into like romance fiction. You know, the Nora Roberts and the Diana Gabaldon type stuff.
My mom too.
Shout out to
I didn't even answer that part of the question. Whoops.
we can get back into it afterwards. Yeah.
Sorry.
And it was actually my grandmother, so my mom's mom, who really encouraged me to read. So she's from the UK, and she would always kind of like push books onto me and my brothers. And I guess I was the one that really latched onto it as something that I enjoyed. And I think the first series that qualifies as SFF and really kind of like stuck with me is Captain Underpants. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this series. I
Classic.
devoured those books when I was in kindergarten, grade 1. So that must have been like 4 or 5. Because it's like a lot of it is pictures. It's kind of a mix between comic and novel. And I just love those books so much. I kept asking my mom, like, I want more. And she would go to the library and pick up the books and bring them home for me. And then after that, I kind of transitioned into series like Redwall was one that my grandma actually introduced me to because she knew that I love animals. So she's like, here, try this, because it just had mice and stuff on the cover. And I loved that series so much. I think I read probably 90% of them, and there's like 22 novels in that series. It's pretty intense. And then Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events as well, I would consider to be like, I don't know, like dark fantasy, but also like satirical fantasy. Super cool series. And I devoured those as well.
Yeah.
And then I think The Hobbit and A Wrinkle in Time. I have A Wrinkle in Time here. This is my old beat up copy from the 90s. Those were 2 books that really solidified everything for me. It was like for science fiction and for fantasy as kind of genres that I really like and connect with, just like the creativity of it and the absurdity that things are so different from the world that we live in, but can be so relatable. And then after that, I say attempted in very big quotes, to read The Lord of the Rings. I have my copies here. So these were given to me by my older brother. So, and I love the art on these copies. These are so beautiful. But as you can see, it's like they're pretty beat up. Some nice busted corners. Yeah. So that, I think I was like 11 or 12 when I attempted to read The Lord of the Rings. And actually the one thing that kind of kept me going through it was like the musicality of it, strangely enough, all the poetry and the singing, because that was the kind of stuff where it's like I could read and it was a little bit easier for me to follow because it rhymed, as opposed to the prose, which is pretty dense. And I reread or attempted again to read the series when I was in high school and finished them all and loved it. Like, absolutely loved it. But it wasn't until university that I think things really took off, in terms of rekindling my love for science fiction and fantasy, because I studied English literature for my bachelor's, and that kind of killed my buzz for books for a while, because it's like, you have to read the classics, and I fucking hate the classics sometimes. So
I feel that
it's like, I do not care. Chaucer was like one of the few.
It's such an approach. Like, it depends on the professor you have. Like, I was afraid that would happen to me, because that's how I got into my degree. And then I was like, what if I come out of it hating everything?
Exactly.
And then I had some brilliant professors though, and I was fine. So
yeah, I mean, Chaucer was Chaucer was like one of the really, like, the much older works of fiction that I love. Like, Canterbury Tales is so funny and
so cheeky.
Yeah, and that was like cool. I love that. But so much of the other stuff that fits into that realm, I think, other than like Beowulf, because Beowulf was just so, it was challenging to read because it's in Old English. But the like creative depth that's there, and like the creatures and the fantastical elements really kept me in it. But a lot of my love was drained away by studying English literature, until I had a class in my final year about post-apocalyptic landscapes. And that class, like you said, Eleni, it's like, if you have a good teacher, someone who's really passionate about it and can get you invigorated to read something and enjoy it, but at the same time critique it, amazing. And we read, that was my first introduction to Philip K. Dick, who's now one of my favorite authors. We read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And at that point, I'd already watched Blade Runner, but didn't realize it was based on this book. So then I had the connection between the two and just fell in love with Philip K. Dick's work. We watched The Matrix. We watched Apocalypse Now. We read The Road, which was really depressing, but super well written. And I think it was just that point that kind of like launched me into my adulthood of really, really loving science fiction and fantasy and rekindling the magic that I had when I was a kid.
So I do have a confession to make, because because it was such a huge influence on me as a kid. As an adult, I have not read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings.
It's okay. It's totally
I've seen the films.
Or recently. Oh, yeah.
I read them all as a kid, and they were so influential that I kind of don't want to read them again, just in case I find something I don't like.
I get that.
Yeah. We'll get into the rereading thing later on, because I'm really curious.
Actually,
Tom, we can touch on that. Go ahead, Eleni.
I'm sorry. Everyone went through the whole process. I just stuck to when I was tiny. So like reading, I mentioned that I went into spooky stuff, which is fair. It's true, because like the way our library at school is like, it wasn't a very big room, and it just had books from the youngest age to the oldest age there, which was like, I don't know, 12. So all of those books were a free-for-all, basically. You had to stick to your age group, but because I read a lot, I was advanced. So I had a deal with my librarian, and she was like, as long as you put it back, you can take out anything you want anytime. And I just went through the whole series of Goosebumps. Just every day I would bring back a new one. I ate them like popcorn, and they were falling apart, these books, because everyone had used them, and they were really like the old Goosebumps, like early Goosebumps. So I would scotch them back together and bring them back repaired. And I was like, can I have the next one, please? And then we had the book fairs at school as well, because I had the luck to go to an international school. So we did things in English. So we had a book fair. And this was my first touch, like Darren Shawn, Cirque du Freak, spooky werewolf, and bloody, gory things inside. I was like, ooh, this is mine. So I just went through a whole, like for a solid decade, through just the spookiest stuff I could find. And then my teacher had Sabriel on the shelf. And it was love forever. I read them, and he only had the first two because he pinched them off his daughter. And I said, well, where's the third one? And he's like, I don't know, there was a third one. You can use Amazon for that. And that's how I discovered Amazon 10 years ago. For the first time ever, I bought my first ever book from there, and was Sabriel series. Right time. And that was fantasy proper.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of sounds like, I mean, you had your librarian, you had people that were kind of encouraging you in your reading journey. But did you feel like when you were younger that there was any personal shame or stigma around reading science fiction, fantasy, even horror in your case?
Well, I wouldn't say stigma per se, but at the same time, none of my friends read as much as I did. So I never felt like it was something that I would share with them. And for that reason, reading always felt like something extremely private to me. Like it was my thing. I would read as much as I wanted, and I would read whatever books I wanted, but it was never something that I could share with anybody. And in fact, I never even knew of a book community more outside of my mom, who, well, she didn't read the same things as me. As we said, romance and everything. But she would always encourage me. She would say, okay, I'm going to read now. Come sit and read your thing next to me. So that was the closest to a sort of community, companionship. But then we had like poetry cafe week at my school. So the teachers would go around and exchange classes, and they would bring the book that they liked to read to the kids. And that's how I discovered Roald Dahl. Like the twits, Matilda. Matilda was my first like mirror into like a child who reads and who likes, books and stuff. And that was a bit of a moment, but I've had people from my family say, what are you reading? I'm reading fantasy. Again? Isn't that the same thing as always? I'm like, no, there's so much in this. Like, aren't you tired of reading fake things? No. Like, it's fantasy, it's fiction, and it gives you empathy in one way. So
yeah. And that's actually something we'll touch on.
Yeah.
Like what fantasy kind of like does for us, but it's nice that you that your mom was encouraging, but it's also kind of shitty that family members were generalizing fantasy and thinking like, oh, it's the same thing over and over again.
They didn't know any better. It was a completely external point of view, but at the same time, I never felt like it was a judgment that I could not care less about. Like, well, it's my thing. It's private. You don't have to like it. So go on your way. I'll go on mine.
Shoot, get out of here.
Yes, do your thing. I don't care.
And Tom, what's your thought on building on what Eleni said? Did you feel like you had people to share it with, or was there any personal shame or more like group stigma towards science fiction and fantasy?
I really didn't. And I think the fact Eleni had the librarian, like everyone needs a librarian like that who can just say, yeah, take out whatever you want. Don't worry about it. When I was a really little kid, I rented the giant jam sandwich from the local library so many times that the librarian said, just keep it. you're going to take it out again anyway. You can just have it.
Uh,
But that was brilliant. I still think back to that and think, I love reading that book on my own. And I'm an only child, so reading for me has always been quite a personal, individual thing. And I just happened to fall into fantasy. One of the books I really loved was the Animorphs. Absolutely devoured that series and the prequels. It was so good, but no one I knew read them. I didn't have anyone to talk to them about, so it was just on my own with my with my imagination. And Tori's cat has just arrived.
cat. Speaking of animals,
Sorry.
Tori's own personal animal.
I went through Goosebumps as well. I really loved the whole "reader beware, you're in for a scare" kind of feel to it.
the series.
There
so
was
good
that
too.
Stigma. Yeah, it was. I had it on VHS. Amazing.
Yeah, me too.
Dum, 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 dum.
Oh, that takes me back, man. That's crazy. But yeah, it became maybe not a stigma, but it was definitely something I enjoyed on my own. Like I say, no one around me read fantasy, and even now, I don't know that many people who read the genre because it still feels a bit closed off sometimes. But that's why we have this blog, and really just meeting everyone here and actually talking about these books all day, every day is so alien to me in a way. That's why I get really excited about things like Phoenix Extravagant, because people will listen. Because they look at this wonderful book
that's
about.
Why you send it. You send it to your aunt too.
She bought it. She read my review and bought it.
Oh, she bought it.
I was so amazed.
That's even better.
I'm telling everyone to read Synopticon at the moment because it's amazing. And yeah, I'm not being paid. I just get excited about these books.
Yeah.
That should be our tagline.
And,
we're not getting paid.
Tori,
we're just very excited.
I think that's a bit implicit in terms of what we're doing. It's like people might assume that we get paid. It's like, no, we don't. We just do this stuff because we love it.
Just excited.
Yeah. Exactly. And Tori, for you, did you kind of have any personal shame or stigma, or was reading something that you shared with people, or was it something that you had for yourself?
No, my mom was probably my biggest influence. She always read to us. My sister and I when we were growing up, and then she was very big into like Lord of the Rings, the movies, and she loved fantasy movies and loved fantasy video games. I remember her playing through Castlevania on our Nintendo 64. And she always played Zelda. She loves Zelda, like still to this day. So yeah, she was probably my biggest supporter, and I get a lot of it from my dad, even though my dad's not really, he was never really in my life, which that's a whole other podcast. But I was always told growing up that I'm a lot like my dad. So I think a lot of that comes from him. But my mom is primarily the biggest supporter that I have when it comes to fantasy and things like that. And as far as like stigma goes, I'm kind of ashamed to say that I was never really open about my interests when I was a kid. I very desperately wanted to fit in, because I've always been big. So when you're big and you get made fun of for it, you find ways to kind of adhere to what the status quo is. And I never really let myself be who I wanted to be, I guess. So when I got to college and I met, a group of friends that, were very like-minded, it pretty much changed how I thought of myself and how I thought of my interests. And then I met Justin, and you've seen our library. We exploded. So coming into my own has been a very long process for me. I was always the weird one in my family. I never really fit in high school, and I was kind of a jerk in high school to people who I thought were weird or who would make me look weird, because I was already trying so hard not to look weird. So I was probably pretty terrible to them, if I'm being completely honest, and I really regret a lot of the things I did. But this is turning into like a therapy session, so I'm just going to stop there and say, yes, there was some stigma, and I fell into it, and that's the end of that story. So thanks for coming.
We are on a bit of a nostalgia trip, so I think it's okay if we delve into this kind of stuff. And Tori, like you, I'm also a bit ashamed because I don't necessarily think it came out of a feeling of shame, but I hid a lot of my science fiction and fantasy reading when I was younger. I think once I got out of elementary school, when it's kind of like no one gives a shit, you're kids, people read whatever they want. Moving on from like Captain Underpants and Redwall and kind of getting into a little bit more difficult stuff. It was very weirdly private thing for me. I shared it with my grandma because she was the kind of person that always encouraged me to read regardless of what it was. She's just like, her mantra was like, language is language, words are words. If you read, you're reading, and that's good, which is something I really appreciate. But it was never something like I would bring my books and read them at school. It's like, no, I always kept them at home, and I always read it at home. And in high school, especially, I didn't really share that stuff outwardly with people. I think reading in particular, but video games and all that kind of stuff, that I think because I have a brother who's a year and a half older and we always shared that together, we would play. I think like one of my earlier memories of fantasy is actually, oh crap, what's it called? It's a point and click adventure, The Secret of Monkey Island, that was on PC, and then Dragon, I think it's called Dungeon Quest or something like that. Crap, I totally forget. I should have looked this up. Anyways, it's like point and click fantasy adventure games for the PC that one of my older brothers was playing. And I remember just like pulling up a chair and just sitting and watching him play that kind of stuff. And then my other brother, since we were so close in age, we would play together. We played Zelda, we played and all the games on N64, and then eventually we just kind of like moved through different console generations. And my friends and I would always play this kind of stuff together. And there was strangely no stigma when it came to video games or movies. I remember one of my older brothers took me to see each of the Lord of the Rings movies at the 11 o'clock screening on like a Thursday. And my mom's like, he has school tomorrow. These movies are 3 hours long. And my brother's like, I don't care. I'm going to take him anyways. And just like, yeah, and just didn't sleep afterwards because I came back from the movie theater just so elated and stoked on everything that was presented in Lord of the Rings. So it was weirdly this thing where it's like books was something I kept private, and then video games and movies was something that was a little more openly accepted, I guess. I don't know what it was, or if it was just part of me that I didn't want to share my reading with other people, and thus it never came up in conversation. So it's just kind of this like weird thing of I found commonality in video games and movies with friends and felt like I could fit in there. But then for some reason, when it came to books, that was something that didn't really, I didn't really find the same level of commonality with people enough that I felt confident to say like, hey, this is what I'm reading, blah, 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 blah. And I just kind of wanted to like avoid judgment, I guess. Because books is like, movies and video games is one thing, but books is like, at my perspective at that time, it felt like another level of, excuse me, another level of, I guess, like geek, you know? It's like
I think
video
it's
games and
the
movies are a
medium.
little bit more accepted, and then reading
Yeah.
felt at that time felt like, oh, you're even more of a nerd if you're super into reading, you know? So
Yeah.
I think it's a bit also what Tom said, like the kind of medium, because video games and movies and stuff, it's more of a communal thing. Like more people will go to the cinema, like, or even when you play, there's a lot of people around you, and you're all essentially doing the same thing. You're all watching the same thing, and you're all doing the same action for the game. Someone's better, someone's worse, but you're all more or less having a same action. And then with reading, the way I picture Treebeard with the way you picture Treebeard is completely different. So it's also it's the subjectivity of reading that makes it more insular.
Yeah, and the physical act of there's only one book, and you're the only person that can read that. It's not like you're, oh, you know, we're all going to sit in a room together and each of us have our copy and we're going to read it at the same time.
You don't get 300 people all sitting around one copy of Lord of the Rings and reading it at the same time. It doesn't work that way. And reading is a lot more intimate anyway. I mean, you make quite a conscious decision to pick up a book and divert some hours of your time to read through it. Whereas a movie is 2 hours, 2.5 hours max, or a video game you might play for half an hour, you put it away, and you go on to something else. So I think that could also be where the stigma comes in, is you're making yourself quite vulnerable to give your time and attention to that book, and you're putting yourself in that world. And with a genre like fantasy and sci-fi, it's so different from where we are in our day-to-day that it can be quite a vulnerable place.
True.
For me, it was
and
a
actually on this note of
too.
Yeah, well, on this note of like vulnerability and intimacy, I mean, you know, Eleni, you touched on it earlier, and Tori as well, sort of like what science fiction and fantasy provided you in terms of like emotional or personal development, empathy, things like this. Eleni, do you want to touch on that a bit more? Like what reading like SFF gave you in that sense?
Yeah, sure. It's something that I say jokingly to other people anytime, but like I will not read something a real life story or a nonfiction something, whatever, that has real life people in it, because I have enough sadness on my own, so I don't need extra added one from the real world. I'll take the fantasy land. But at the same time, like I said, it was a safe space for me in high school, for example, because like I created this, I don't want to say persona because it wasn't different from who I was, but I gave this image of myself that I'm the one who at recess or break reads, and I am in my little cocoon and world. And my classmates were like, okay, she reads, she's no fun to pick on. So I would hear the others go and make a mess or pester each other or even hurt each other, you know, play fighting and whatever. And I was in my little corner safe because I was reading. And also like the simple distraction aspect of it, like you go through big changes in life and you need some time off from real life. So when I moved out for college or university, I changed country. It was the first time that I completely moved away on my own, and I had no friends. I am a shy person in general, so it's not like my first day in uni I met everyone and I started hanging out with everyone suddenly. It's not who I am. I don't really go out much. So I had the books and they were my only company while I was home alone before I made some friends. So I'm fine with that. Like I didn't feel too lonely, or because I had this fantasy land that I could go into. And I mean, I mostly read fantasy, and I'm getting more into sci-fi these last few years because I'm learning more about it, but mainly fantasy, like I think it's Ryria in English. I've always said Ryria because it's more like Italian, but Michael J. Sullivan.
That sounds nicer.
Yeah, it's more Italian. But I remember it was the first fan email I ever wrote. I was like, I need to tell this author that his books made me feel safe, made me feel not lonely while I changed countries. So it's always been a safe haven for me.
Yeah. And Tori, you mentioned earlier that you, starting with Twilight and especially with Hunger Games, you had this feeling of like connecting with the characters and feeling like reading them on the page really helped you, I guess, to understand yourself a little bit better. Do you want to dig into that a little bit more, like how reading science fiction and fantasy has aided you in like personal and emotional growth?
I just want to say that I may need to duck out after this because my family's coming over for my graduation, so I kind of gotta. But to answer your question, I'll say that it's very hard to answer your question. With books like Twilight, I don't want to turn this into another exploring my own psyche rant like I did a few minutes ago, but I was very, very much under the impression that I was going to live the rest of my life alone. And I was a kid, so obviously, I didn't know any better, but I thought that I was unlovable. And I read, I read books with romance interests, and I read books with romantic plot lines, and Twilight and the Hunger Games, they had those for me. They had obviously Bella and Edward, and then Katniss and Peeta, and then I found that it was more than that. I found that it wasn't just the love aspect that I really enjoyed. It was these characters that were taking control of their lives. Katniss is in a remotely controlled arena, and people are watching her every move. And Bella is constantly put into situations where she's weak, and she's very much human, surrounded by non-humans, and they're both put in these situations where they don't have any control, and then over the course of the series they take that control back, and it's just really, really empowering to watch and to read and to just be viscerally a part of. Because when I read, I don't just read. I'm in there, and I'm right next to the characters.
Yeah.
I read deeply, I guess, is what you could call it.
You empathize.
Yeah, I guess. And then I guess that's a good word. Yeah. But anyway, my train of thought is gone.
You're with the characters.
Yes,
they're good role models.
Exactly. And for someone who always felt like an outcast, and like someone who always felt like nothing they did would ever warrant any kind of affection, be it platonic or romantic, they were just a really, really good way for me to become somebody that I always wanted to be.
Yeah, I think fantasy and science fiction provides a good imaginative outlet for us to place ourselves in others' shoes and understand what it could be like if we were to be someone different, and just perceive like what we might potentially want to become in the future, or at least change some aspects of ourselves slowly but surely, but in a way that makes us feel like I'm becoming a better person, or I'm becoming more of who I want to be, and that's something that science fiction and fantasy always gave me. And Tom, I'll pitch the same question to you about what kind of growth, emotional, personal, what have you, fantasy and science fiction gave you.
The book that's springing to mind, and this will sound really silly, but some of the most incredible fantasy, sci-fi, horror books are ones that actually understand who you are as a reader. And one, but one huge book for me was My Hairiest Adventure, the Goosebumps one, because that it touches in on that sort of teenage fear of, oh my god, my body is changing. What the hell is happening? Yeah. I was a hairy kid. It will not surprise you to hear. So, I was so much hairier than all my classmates. And there's this story about a guy who's grown hair on the backs of his hands. And thankfully, I wasn't turning into a dog like he was. But it still helped me process what was happening to me. Like, this is body horror. This is interesting to read through. But, I am going through things. I'm growing up. And it's scary. It was a good way to channel. Horror. Yeah, it hit too close to the bone, but it's good to channel that. And again, going back to what Eleni said, when you have these safe places, I love those books that take you to that fantasy world. Narnia is the classic one because it starts off in such a normal way, and then they go through a cupboard and they're in this brand new fantasy world, and it's escapism for these kids who are hauled up in a place they're not familiar with, where we've all been in situations where we don't really know where we're going or what's going on. So when we can read about these characters who are put in situations where they're not comfortable or they're going through hardship, and it's such a powerful thing to read, especially when you're a kid.
Yeah,
I can't believe I forgot Narnia earlier. It's like that was such a pivotal series for me too.
I had a big wardrobe like the one in Narnia because I lived in a house that had antique furniture from the previous owner. I saw that movie, I just ran to that wardrobe because I was like, oh, this is my chance. But yeah, it helps you grow, doesn't it? And it's, you try to be like these characters, like especially with stories of change like Narnia, like I'm thinking of even the Sabriel series, or I could say Cirque du Freak, but I haven't read all of them entirely. But other series that I've read, that when you're not good with change and you have a hard time processing change, these books are a Hail Mary almost, because they really help you understand that change isn't bad.
Yeah.
And I think for
the
me,
necessary context.
Yeah, for me as well, the reason I fell into the Lone Wolf series, these lit RPGs so much, is my parents divorced when I was in my early teens. And just like that, your entire life changes completely. And I was in secondary school, so that's a pretty stressful time anyway. So to have that control of a story, like, I'm the hero, I can do whatever I want, I can choose what spells I have, I can choose what weapons I come along and bring with me, and I can choose my own adventure. Same with choosing a book. It doesn't have to be a lit RPG. You can find a new series that you just lose yourself in. It's really powerful to read these books and to, if you want to, just escape your normal life for a bit, because sometimes you need to do that.
Yeah, completely. And just to wind down and close out, I want to know, Eleni, we'll start with you. If you think that now that geek culture, science fiction and fantasy are much more mainstream, if you think that gives this younger generation a leg up on us, and then on top of that, if you feel optimistic about the future of science fiction and fantasy, especially in the hands of young kids.
Well, I'm an optimist at heart, so I can say that I think it's going well, because, as you said, like, I do think that young people have a leg up on us now, because I'm the youngest of this group. So I am at that borderline where I could touch and see how it used to be before and how it's changing into now. And it's not this, being a geek is not the same, doesn't mean the same thing as it meant once. And the internet has been incredible for this, because now you have a wider space to share your passion. You have the freedom to do so and the encouragement to do so in a way that you didn't before. Like, let's not consider toxic fandoms and all that stuff, because that's a whole other list of crap that you cannot get into. But staying in the wholesome side of it, you can say that young people have forums where they can see that it's fine to read and enjoy and have fun and just, well, they say young people are lazy because they sit and read all day, but they said the same thing decades ago. Oh, young people are always at the arcade. There's always something wrong with young people. So you might as well do something that makes you happy. And books now are far more accessible. You go inside, you go in a bookstore, and there's the fantasy, well, not fantasy, but the fiction section is ginormous. Now you can find anything. There's so many subgenres. There's so many. I think it's good. Like, there's a much bigger openness for people, and even the whole discourse with TikTok being a good thing or a bad thing, book talk and whatnot. It's, for me, is wonderful, because young people get to mix mediums and see that you can have so much more and you can connect so much more, even with something so private as with reading. Like, I discovered book Twitter last year, like little over a year ago, and a whole world opened for me. And that was because I, as a person, was not very social media-y. Like, I never kept into media because I never bothered. I read. But discovering that I could bring my love into the world of social media it opened a floodgate. And I think it's great for young people now because they see so much. And fantasy is changing as well. It's more inclusive. I'm not saying it's perfect yet, but it's on a good way, I think. It's
I completely
working
agree.
towards changing the classics and turning them, like, keeping good tropes, moving on from dicier ones and opening up, and more voices, more cultures. And I'm really optimistic about this. It looks good to me.
Yeah, I feel similar to you. And just touching on TikTok, it's like, on one hand, yeah, social media could be bad for kids in some way, but I think it's also really really interesting and amazing that kids can see their favorite authors communicating with them in some kind of way. And the fact that these kids could be able to find a sense of community, they can seek out their community. And if it turns out to be toxic, they can just step away and find another community. Yeah. And I think that, for me, I'm really optimistic about that. Is like, I didn't really have too many avenues of finding good community. Really, like, outside of select friends who I could talk about this kind of stuff with and share it with, until I became a part of FanFiAddict and started doing this podcast and started blogging and reviewing books. Like, it's not easy to find a healthy community of people to talk with about your passions. But I think kids now have the tech savvy and the ability to find more avenues for communicating and talking about this kind of stuff. Yeah.
And we still have
this sort of thing didn't exist. This sort of medium didn't exist. There was no TikTok, there was no Instagram, social media at all. And one of the game changers for fantasy literature, in my mind, is the Harry Potter series. And we talked about books we read as kids. We haven't mentioned Harry Potter yet, which I feel that maybe we have to. But I can't remember any series of books that had the same impact as that. And I was the generation where they came out as we were in the same school year as Harry and Hermione and Ron. So I feel like there is that whole generation of us who read these books as children, and that just sparked something. Whether J.K. Rowling meant to or not, she sort of changed the game in terms of how people appreciate stories, and it feels she almost created fandom. I don't remember anything like the sort of Potter or anything like that you get now, but I feel there's that whole generation now who are starting to have children who you've got over that stigma, and we've now all geeked out together about all of these books because we found FanFiAddict, we found Twitter, Book Twitter, and now we can say, well, look, we've mucked around and we've worried about reading fantasy books, so you don't have to. This is my favorite book I read. It's Red War. Off you go. I've got a copy of The Hobbit that's waiting for when my daughter is old enough to read it. She's 3 months, so she's not going to read it yet. But
Well,
I'm thinking I'll write a letter.
Yeah, start them young.
So my idea was I just write a letter to her now and say, you're 3 months old, and this is how everything is now. But this book was really important for me, so I hope it's going to spark something for you. Or you just might like Mills and Boone and crap like that. I don't know.
But also the Percy Jackson wave, in a way, because with Rowling, sort of, I don't want to say she started a domino, but at the same time she kind of did. But then in came Percy Jackson, in came all of Suzanne Collins and the Divergent series, and
Christopher Paolini with Aragon too.
Paolini with Aragon as well. Yeah, there was a whole bunch of YA to adultish sort of books that they grew up with their audiences. They started middle grade and then they matured as their audiences matured eventually. And I think that also helped to it was you went hand in hand with these series and you grew up. And like you said, fandom wasn't a thing until a few years ago. Widely speaking, it's a few years that fandom really boomed. And yeah, it's much better now.
Yeah, but like you said as well, Eleni, that now there's more diversity and there's more opportunity beyond the fandom bubble that was created back in the 2000s. Now there's a potential for authors from different races and ethnicities and backgrounds to create fiction for kids moving into teens, moving into adulthood, to give them somebody who they can connect with and feel like I'm represented, or I feel like I can put myself in the shoes of this character and I still feel like myself, as opposed to someone from an African background reading Harry Potter and thinking, okay, I gotta put myself in the shoes of this these white people.
Yeah, exactly. So, it was a discourse with dark academia, which is a whole other thing. I will not get lost into this now, but it's a whole deal of, there was this idea that reading had to be a high class hobby, and you had to read the classics, and you had to read certain books, and you had to read The Lord of the Rings, and if you wanted to read fantasy, you had to read The Lord of the Rings, you had to read Narnia, you had to read certain books. When I was younger and I was entering into fantasy, I was thinking about this. I was like, okay, what do I need to read? And the bookstores at the time had those fixed 4 books, the 4 series. If you want to be a nerd on this, you have to and know these, with comics. But now we've shrugged this off. We're you want to read this. And hey, there's so many new voices, read them.
Yeah, the barrier to entry is completely lowered at this point. It's not like you have to read fantasy by a crotchety old white man in order to feel like you are a fan of fantasy. It's no, there are so many different niches that cater to so many different people from backgrounds all across the world. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we'll close out there. And if you could tell viewers, listeners, where they can find you on social media, read your reviews, but also just give a quick recommendation for your quintessential fantasy or sci-fi book or series for kids.
Oh no!
So we'll start with you, Eleni.
Ladies first now. Well, I feel like I'm always talking this panel. No. So, what was the question? No. Basically, well, let's go with last first. So the quintessential fantasy for me, well, depends what subgenre. So I keep saying this, wherever you see me, I will talk about Sabriel Garth Nix, the Old Kingdom series. It's so good for so many reasons. And Sabriel is my top comfort book. I can show you. Whoops. My oldest copy, it even has sun damage. I don't know if you can really see it, but you can tell it used to be on my windowsill, because this is my oldest copy, and it introduces you to a heroine who has to get into a new world. There's magic, there's necromancy, and it's YA, so it's, I don't want to say easy because that makes it feel like it's less than it is, but it's more accessible. So to me, it's a very good intro into fantasy. It has classical tropes, but it's not old. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. Instagram, I'm not that much active book-wise, although most of my pictures are of my bookshelves. So there I'm at the words we read, and each word is separated by an underscore. And on Twitter, which is where I am mostly active for the book community, it's Eleni Argyro. I blog with FanFi and also with Before We Go blog from Beth Tabler. She was the first person to introduce me into blogging. Like, I would like to write for you. Can I write here? And she was like, yes, please. So that was great. And that's where I am mostly at, Twitter.
Cool. And also there's lots of photos of Eleni's dog on Twitter as well. So
that is also true. It's the face of my social media is Figaro, the old gent. So come for the dog, stay for some book recommendations.
And Tom, Quintessential SFF Book, and then let everyone know where they can find you.
Quintessential Book. I'm going to stick with the Lone Wolf series because it was such an amazing adventure, and there's so many of them. You can get them really cheap on eBay. They're like a couple of quid each. Just real scenery chewing fantasy D&D sort of writing, and it's why I love stories to this day, because I've got to be the hero each time. And if for some reason you would like to follow me on the socials, I am on Twitter. My name is Tom Bookbeard, but I'm at Tom4T, TOMFORPEA. And I also post on Jeff's Beard board, and that's where you can find all the pictures of the beard.
Cool. Thank you, Tom. And that's Fishfinger Rosty on Jeff's Beard board, right?
I am Fishfinger Rosty on Jeff's Beard board, because Fishfinger Rosty is a sandwich I once made, and I couldn't think of a username.
It's a fantastic username. Yeah.
Fish fingers.
Well, Tori had to. Tori had to step out early, but she is on Instagram and Twitter at Toriyo Reads. That's TORIYO Reads. And then for me, just a quick personal recommendation: A Wrinkle in Time, for sure. From my perspective, is both it's both approachable enough in terms of its prose and its story and its themes, for someone who's kind of like transitioning from being a child into more of like a preteen kind of thing. And it's really good in terms of its themes of maturing as a person, owning up to your mistakes, and learning how to be a leader, or at least be proud of who you are. And I think that was a very pivotal book for me. And yeah, I can't think of a better one to recommend, because The Lord of the Rings is like, yeah, it's awesome, but it's fucking difficult. Dense. It's hefty. It's very dense. Yeah. So I think A Wrinkle in Time is definitely something that people could read and find meaning in, and hopefully take some good lessons from that. So Eleni, Tom, thank you so much for joining me today. I had a blast chatting with you.
Thanks for hosting. It's great fun.
Yeah, hope to see you again.
Tom, yeah,
hope you want to have us again.
Of course. Tom, your beard is welcome back, but you're not.
Just pleases the beard.